Alrighty, y'all. We'll get started here. Hard to believe it, but it's that time. So let's find our seats. Get ready for Sunday school this morning. And want to give you a couple updates on some things. Okay. Good morning, Ben. Alrighty, so many of you have been praying for Robbie. Robbie had an amputation procedure. It's probably been 2 weeks now. And talked to him last night. Things are progressing. They're trying to get some things done with kind of his sensitivity with food before he can move into rehab, and then that's going to be a 10-day at least period there in Kansas City, and then he can come home. And so he really wanted me to pass on thank you for the prayers. Some people in our church wished him happy birthday on Facebook, all those type of things. He's just really grateful for that. As you can imagine, being kind of stuck in the hospital in Kansas City is kind of a lonely thing. So be praying for Robbie. Continue to pray for him, okay? And then I know Miss Glenda's got a surgery coming up on her ankle. And then a couple other things. Don't forget, church family, after the morning service today, we'll have a very brief meeting for our members. And when I say brief, it should only take 5 minutes. So what we'll do is we'll have 5-10 minutes to just greet, fellowship, and then we will have 5 minutes or so of business meeting, just following up on the last business meeting on our members list, and then I'll send you off. On top of that, really want to encourage you, next Sunday is our Freedom Feast. So next Sunday, as a church, we're going to have lunch together at Scout Park. The address is in your book. I want to encourage families to be there. We're going to try and get a bounce house for the kids. We're going to have some food. The church is catering pulled pork. And then folks can bring sides and desserts. So if you could sign up there at the back table. I think we found a good facility that'll be kind of friendly to all age groups. There's cover. There's a bathroom. There's things like that, so people of all ages can feel comfortable joining us. There's actually a good amount of parking there as well. There's a playground there. So it's really kind of built for this sort of thing, I think. So I want to encourage you, church, if you could, love to see a few more folks sign up this Sunday at the back table to join us next Sunday after the morning service for our Freedom Feast, okay? That'll take place at Scout Park. Other than that, I don't think there's anything immediately coming up on the calendar, so I just want to note those things for you. Continue to be praying for some of the Bible study opportunities that I'm working through with various people to share the gospel, to talk about church membership, things like that. Would really appreciate that, okay? Let's dive into our lesson, though, this morning, okay? So let's jump in, and you can hold your place. Maybe we're going to be in a lot of scriptures, but we're going to be in 1 Corinthians 7 here in a minute. So let's dive into the lesson time this morning. We are right at the tail end of our series, Christians at Work. And I so appreciated the involvement of other men in our church in teaching this series. And what we're going to do this morning is I think we're going to explore something that'll be helpful to some of you in the room now or maybe later, because when we say this word work, most of us, we picture something in our mind, right? When we talk about work, how would most of us define work? When we say we're going to work, what are we thinking of when we say that word normally? I know you all haven't, you are tracking with me. Someone's going to say, Mike, is that you who's talking? Or Mark? Yeah, your job, right? You're 9 to 5. Some of you, obviously most of you don't work 9 to 5, but you're 7 to 4, whatever the case may be for some of you. A salaried or an hourly pay employment arrangement. That's how most of us think of work. And a lot of what we've talked about has pertained to that and has specific application to that, right? Maybe I should have done this lesson on the front end so some of you folks who are in these other life stages would apply the series to these other things. But I think we got to answer this question. How do you apply what we're talking about when maybe you're not in a traditional employment situation? For example, what relevance does Christians at work have to your retirement? Or what relevance does this have when you are a caretaker? Many people step back their hours or stop their hours because they're a caretaker of some sort. Maybe a stay-at-home mother, maybe taking care of an elderly parent. Some people, they're taking care of an elderly spouse that has poorer health than they do. How do we apply these principles if you're a volunteer, right? Many of us, hopefully, have other ways that we are working for the good of society outside of our employment. And yet, what we're going to talk about today is how we think about those things. And what I want to call those, you might write this term at the top of your page, but I'm going to call these exceptional callings. Exceptional callings. What I mean by that is not that they're rare, right? There's plenty of people in here who will be retired or a caretaker or a volunteer. But it's that we don't normally think of these as callings from God, right? Sometimes we talked about this early in the series that when we think of a calling from God, we picture someone who's like, God has appointed them for a special job, a special ministry, right? But a calling from God, as we have seen, is anything that God, through his word or through specific directions outside of his word, whether it be providence or whatever, the Holy Spirit is asking us to do. So normally our callings might be to be a spouse or to be an employee or to be a dad or, all sorts of things, a son or a daughter, right? These are callings from God. They are responsibilities, roles in our life that God has given to us that have a certain amount of jobs associated with them. Oftentimes we don't think of being a caretaker as a calling. Some people do, some people don't. Sometimes people are caretakers because it seems like it's kind of forced upon them in life. Dad falls ill and someone has to take care of it and all the other siblings don't care enough, right? But what I want to talk about is, number one, I want to show you that these exceptional callings are work. These exceptional callings are work, and much of what we talked about applies to them. But number two, I want to show you from the Bible just some specific encouragements and challenges if you find yourself in any of these three exceptional callings. And we could expand the list to unemployment is a calling at times. God puts us in a place of unemployment. Being a student is a calling. Sometimes people are students, and that deserves work, doesn't it? So here's the first thing I want to show you this morning. I want you to understand that we work in more places than our work. I know all of you understand this, right? We work in more places than our work. It's not just your 9 to 5, your normal day job, your 12 to 8, whatever it is for some of you, that you work in places you don't get a paycheck, right? I want you to remember, who was the first human that ever was called to work? Who was the first human ever called to work? Adam. Adam's pointing at himself. Not that Adam. Different Adam. Adam didn't work for a paycheck, right? In fact, if you asked Adam if he was employed, he probably would have scratched his head and looked at you strangely, right? Work doesn't necessarily have to be something that has a paycheck at the end of it, right? Work is anything we're doing to care for God's creation and God's world, right? Anything that we fit into that big job of caring for God's creation, God's world, God's people, Adam was gathering food. He was naming animals, and he was doing all sorts of other things, maybe today that we would typically think of as household tasks or farming or ranching, right? His work consisted of things that we would group in those various categories. But we understand that though Adam didn't have a job per se, where he had a paycheck, that Adam was working, right? He was doing the things that are bringing order to God's creation. So what I want to make the case for you this morning is even if you don't have a job, right? So our brother Paul, he's waiting for his work authorization to be able to get back into the workforce. There's work for him, right? If you're retired, there's work for you. It's just not going to look like a traditional employment arrangement. And so I think what could be tempting, I want to speak to those who maybe aren't traditionally employed. It could be tempting to think that if you don't have that kind of work, that maybe your roles are less important. If you're retired, if you're unemployed, if you're a caretaker and you're not making money that significantly contributes to the bills in the house, you can feel like that sort of job is less important. Maybe you feel important at your day job, but on your weekends when you're taking care of things around the house, it doesn't feel as important. And so many men and women can neglect those duties because of this sort of understanding. But here's what I want you to understand from 1 Corinthians 7, okay? Paul actually speaks to this concern that certain types of work maybe are less important. And here's what Paul teaches us, that we can glorify God in every calling he places on us. Remember, friends, you have more than one calling in your life, right? You're an employee, a son, husband, daughter, whatever the case may be. So you're working in multiple different roles, right, in your life. None of those are less important, or unimportant, I should say. None of those are unimportant, right? Now, Paul, when he's writing the letter to 1 Corinthians, Paul's writing in a very different society than we live in America. There's similarities, but there are big differences. If you were the bottom of the totem pole in the city of Corinth, you were a slave. Now, slavery in Corinth worked a little differently than slavery in America did, from what we're familiar with our history. But you can imagine if someone's a Christian, Paul seems to be addressing that there is this temptation that if I'm a Christian and I'm a slave, I don't have as much freedom to decide where my time goes. Maybe it's all I can do to get to church. They would probably have church on Sunday nights back then because they were working in the fields during the day. And so a Christian would be tempted to think, look, if I'm a slave, then I can't do as important work. And so what I need to do is do everything I can. Maybe even I have to disobey the law to find my freedom so that I could do more important work for God. Now, friends, I know none of you are slaves, thankfully. We're thankful for a country that doesn't have slavery. But I want you to think about this. How many times are you tempted to think that maybe what you're doing, a certain type of work, is less important? You think, well, I got to get away from the house and back to my job because it's more important there. I got to get out of the garden and back over here because this work is less important. But here's what I want you to see what Paul says. Paul tells us that every calling God gives us is important. Listen to 1 Corinthians 7, verses 20 through 24. Paul uses this term calling to speak of different roles God has placed you in life. He says, let every man abide or remain in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called being a servant? We would maybe use the word slave. Are you a slave? Don't worry about it. Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. So notice this. Paul's not saying it's wrong to take advantage of opportunities that maybe provide greater freedom, right? It's not wrong. But he says, don't let it deceive you into thinking you're doing something less important, right? For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. Meaning, listen, if you're a slave in society, don't let that make you think that you're less important to God. You're free in God's eyes. You're not a slave, right? Likewise, also he that is called, being free, is Christ's servant. So if you have your freedom and you're not a slave, hey, you need to remember that you're a slave of Christ. You're his servant. He's your master. You are bought with a price. Be not the servants of men. So here's what Paul is saying to this church. He's saying, listen, take opportunities if you have opportunities to do something that seems bigger and better for your life. But don't think that you're less important to God if you're a slave. Don't think that you're less important to God if you've got a lower job in society. Don't think that you're less important to God if you're retired and you're not employed. Don't think you're less important to God if you're a caretaker right now and you can't do as many hours in the workplace. God has placed those callings on you. Remain in them in so much as you don't have opportunity to get out of them. So friends, if it has fallen upon your family to take care of an elderly family member, and really there's no ethical way out of it, right? You're the only one who can help mom and dad right now. And it feels like, man, I'm not doing things that feel more important. I wish I could be with my kids more. I wish I could travel more. I wish I could be back in my full-time job more, but I've got grandma to take care of. Listen, God has put that in your life. Don't think you're doing less important things by taking care of that responsibility. But if God avails an opportunity where maybe that person passes away or maybe someone else is willing to step up, don't feel guilty for passing on that opportunity because God's given you the opportunity to move on. So let me talk about these specific callings that God might place on our lives, and certainly we could expand the list more. I want to talk about the calling of retirement. The calling to be retired. Now, if you're unemployed, many of these principles that actually fit you as well. Or if you find yourself in a time where you are unemployed, the principles here will actually be really helpful to you as well. So I want to speak to those who are retired. Some of y'all, you're not retired, but you're like counting down the days, right? You're like, hey, I got 6.35 years until I'm retired, right? Hey, all of us who are further away are a little bit jealous of you, okay? But I just want to shape your vision for what a biblical view of retirement could be. I'm not going to tell you what to do with every hour of your day. I'm just giving you principles that I think are really firmly rooted in the scripture to shape your vision. So if you're 5 years out from retirement, man, this is the perfect time for you to think about this. Right? So that you can begin thinking and planning around this, okay? First of all, here's the benefit of being retired, or dare I say, if you're unemployed. Okay, unemployment comes with some unique challenges of trusting God with finances, but if you don't have a regular place of employment right now, here's one of the benefits, one of the blessings God has given you that you need to be careful how you manage. And it's this, that retirees have unique resources and opportunities, okay? If you're retired, you have unique resources and opportunities. And I want to talk about those for a minute, okay? So let's think about these. You might write these down on your page as well to just think about when someone's retired or maybe they're in a season where they don't have to work or they can't work, what are some of the things they might have? This is not true for every retiree or every unemployed person, but several of these will be true, okay? Number one, here's a unique resource you have. You have what I call flexibility. Flexibility, okay? When someone retires, here's what you've done. You've cleared your calendar. Now, I'm not saying your calendar's empty, but you have more time and you can be more flexible in how you use that time. It used to be, if you wanted to go for a morning walk, right? You would have to go at a certain time, but when you're retired, you have the flexibility to say, you know what? I want to sleep a little extra. I want to get some things done around the house, what the case may be, and I'll go for a walk at 9 a.m. when everyone else is working, right? That's a blessing. That's a unique opportunity, right? So being a retiree doesn't mean you have to fill every hour of your schedule. I don't want you to misunderstand me. We should enjoy the unique blessings of this season of life. But now we have flexibility where instead of being forced to use our time to serve our employer, we now can use our time to serve other things. Our children, our spouse, work on the house, our neighbors, our church, all sorts of other things. Here's another benefit of being a retiree, okay? None of these will be on the screen, but I want you to maybe write them down. Wisdom. Wisdom. Now, old age doesn't automatically equal wisdom, but Proverbs says this in Proverbs 16:31, that gray hair is a crown of glory, right? What do you think the writer has in mind there? He's saying that there's something unique when you've had a lot of experience in life, right? Some of you understand that even if you're not retired, if you've been in your job for 5-10 years, right? So let's just take Judson. Judson, how long have you been a machinist? 7 years, right? But there's a lot of people at your job who are newer than you in the shop. Judson's not an old guy. We can all tell. He's younger than pretty much everyone in the room. But the experience comes with wisdom, right? You've seen a lot of projects. You've seen a lot of mistakes on these machines, right? In the same way, on a bigger scale, if you're a retiree, you've experienced a lot of things, and sometimes we all know we have to learn by experience, right? Sometimes we only learn by our mistakes, and if you're older, well, you've made a lot of mistakes in life, right? And so you've learned a lot of lessons. That's a unique resource that God has given you that you should do something with. You shouldn't just keep that to yourself. Number 3, often if you're retired, you're older, you come with a lot of Bible knowledge that you've accumulated over the years. If you faithfully serve the Lord, if you've been in church, now I think you should be more invested in God's kingdom than 1 hour a week, but let's just say you've been in church for 1 hour a week for 50 adult years. That's a lot of hours. That's roughly 2,500 plus hours of learning and thinking about the Bible, okay? There's something valuable there that you can give and use to help someone else, right? That's not something that happens automatically. That doesn't happen quickly. You can't just accumulate all of that wisdom and not just hearing the Bible and learning about the Bible, but seeing it applied in the church as the church deals with situations, right? Furthermore, as a retiree, you have a unique resource of perspective. Perspective. We were in Ecclesiastes 7 a few weeks ago in our Sunday morning series, and we heard this very strange thing that the writer said. He said that it's better to be in the house of mourning than in the house of feasting. It's better to be at a funeral than a birthday party. Well, why is that? Well, as someone who is retired or older, as your life, I hate to say it, is drawing to somewhat of a close, though we're not predicting when you might end your life, being near the end of your life gives you a perspective that is not easily gained, right? And that is something that you have that you can share and do something with. Furthermore, again, this is going to vastly differ for different retirees. Sometimes there is a resource of money, right? Now, not every retiree is rich. Most retirees aren't, right? You're on a fixed income. But I know many people, they work really hard in their lifetime, so maybe they're not rich, but they're flexible, right? They don't have to pay for diapers. They still have bills. They still have worries. They still have problems. But maybe there's some flexibility and other things they can use their money for. Now, here's what I want you to think of, okay? The typical American view of retirement, some people call it the American dream. And by the way, if you travel to other countries, I want you to understand the idea of being retired is just not a thing in certain contexts. Like I was in Mexico, and actually in like kind of first world-ish Mexico, and the idea of retirement is just not a thing as much there. So we can understand that being an American, this idea of retirement is very unique. It's not common in the world. It's only common in like first world Western countries, right? But the typical view of retirement is that people retire so they can stop working so much, right? Obviously. And what many people view retirement as is kind of this end of the rainbow time of relaxation and flexibility to choose whatever you want. But here's what I want you to think about, is that if we're Christians, we have to recognize that we are not the lords of our time. We don't get to just do whatever with our life. If you're a slave of Christ, as the verse we just read said, even your retirement, even your end-of-life years are to be submitted to Jesus Christ, and we have to think about what that looks like. And so here's a couple of things the Bible teaches. Number one, God keeps you on earth to serve others. These are not my words. I'm going to read you the words of an old man who was retirement age, though he wouldn't have had the resources to be retired because it didn't exist in first century Christianity. But I want you to listen to Paul's words, how he thinks about the end years of his life. Here's what he says about the end of his life. He says, if I can click it, he says that my bonds in Christ are manifest in the palace and in all other places. And many of my, this is the wrong verse, right? Here's what Paul says. I'm going to look at Philippians chapter 1. Here's what Paul says when he starts talking about being old. He says, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. It's not going to be on the screen. But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor. Yet what I shall choose, I know not. For I am in a strait between two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Every old person I know is like, looking forward to meeting Jesus. That's awesome. But he says, I'm not meeting Jesus. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. And having this comes, I know that I shall abide, I shall remain on this earth and continue with you all. Why? For your furtherance and joy of faith. Here's what Paul's saying. He's saying, as someone who's not dead and not with Christ, the reason I'm on this earth is to help you grow in Christ. This is not unique to an apostle. This is something that is to shape all of us as Christians. We are on this earth to help God's kingdom, to serve other people. Here's how I'd put it. Greater freedom from certain cares of life should be spent on the work of the kingdom. Now, I'm not saying if you don't have 8 hours a day for your employment, you have to spend 8 hours a day in the church or on Jesus, or you're a sinner. I'm not saying that, okay? But I want you to see, Paul writes about this idea elsewhere where if we're on this earth and we have time, that time is to be allocated to doing spiritual good to other people. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul is writing about single people, okay? People who are not married. And once again, in our culture, if someone's single, they may or may not grieve that. Some people do, some people don't. But the extra time that is allocated, not spending time with your wife, maybe not taking care of kids. Most people say, well, that time is not free time for me. At least that's a benefit of being single. But that's not what Paul thought of this idea of being single. Paul said if you're single and you don't have family responsibilities that you have to manage, you take that time and you invest it back in God's kingdom. And I think this idea of singleness applies to retirement. Most retirees are probably married. But I think the idea is here, look, if you don't have certain cares in this life, you take that time and you reinvest it in the kingdom. Listen to this in 1 Corinthians 7. I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried cares for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married cares for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. So he's saying, look, you have things you have to do with your time. If you're married, you have home responsibilities. You got to take care of your wife. That's a good thing. If you're not married, well, there's no wife that you have to take care of. So you have time, and you should be caring for the things of the Lord, right? And again, he talks about a woman who's married and an unmarried woman. The unmarried woman cares for the things of the Lord, but she that is married cares for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Here's the principle. Okay, listen very carefully. Here's the principle that applies to retirement and, of course, singleness. Freedom from certain earthly responsibilities should be used for greater service in God's kingdom. Do you see that principle? If you don't have certain responsibilities that are normal in this life, the freedom that is there should be used for service in God's kingdom. Okay? Now, again, Paul's not talking about retirement in this text specifically, but I think the principle applies. Again, Paul couldn't have even conceived of retirement. It wasn't a thing. Now, let's talk about the calling to be a caretaker, okay? I want to talk about the calling to be a caretaker. If you're a stay-at-home mom, if you're caring for an elderly parent, or many of you, you come home from your job, listen, you work hard, but you're on second shift when you come home. That's how every dad and mom should be thinking here. You're not off of work, you're on second shift. Because many people, here's where they mess up in their parenting. They thought, oh, I'm home, I should get a break now. You owe me a break. I'm home now. No, you're just changing to a different job. You've just changed your uniform and you've walked into a different workplace. Just because you went to work at Tyson or at your place of employment, you're home now, doesn't mean you get a break from the job of being a caretaker of your children, your spouse. So let's think about this job of being a caretaker, okay? I've given you examples. Now let me ask you a question. If someone is a caretaker, are they working? Yeah. If you tell a stay-at-home mom she doesn't work, you're liable to get slapped in the face, right? Right? Men, if you have a stay-at-home wife, don't say that, okay? I don't think I've made this mistake. I don't think so, but you could ask Shelby if I've made that mistake. But I want you to understand that the work here is work that the Bible speaks to, whether it's a stay-at-home parent, stay-at-home caretaker, or someone who's caretaking after their other job, okay? Here's what I want you to remember about this work, okay? That the Bible says that true Christ-likeness is expressed in serving those who cannot return the favor. Jesus said this very clearly. If we hear Jesus' words in Luke 6, they will remind us so much of caretakers. And I want to give you kind of my translation of them. If you love those who love you, what kind of credit is that to you? For sinners love those who love them. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Friends, that describes, in my opinion, the work of a caretaker, of a parent, of someone taking care of an elderly parent or spouse. It's someone who's serving a person who can't possibly return the favor. And this is really difficult, isn't it? Like, there's a unique challenge to this job of being a caretaker, right? Because caretakers don't get paid, right? No stay-at-home mom collects a check paid by her children for all of the things she does, right? Your elderly parents, I would doubt, if you have to take care of them, are paying you for that. But listen very carefully. When you do work to take care of others in your family, here's the lack of a paycheck is actually an opportunity to show what's truly in your heart. Because I think your heart to serve people is most truly shown when you're not getting paid to do it. So listen, I would be careful of judging your heart based on being a hard worker at work when you get paid. What really reveals your heart and your dedication is how hard you work when you're not getting paid. How hard you work at home. How hard you work as a volunteer. Friends, I want you, if you're taking care of people, I want you to remember that caretaking is the heart of the Christian faith. It's the heart of the Christian faith. James 1:27. So the New Testament letter James, he's saying, let me define to you what pure religion is. What like the most sincere, unhypocritical form of Christianity is. And what does he say? Caring for the fatherless and the widow. He talks about caretaking, right? Pure religion is looking after orphans and widows. And I think James would agree wholeheartedly. Being a caretaker for an aging parent who's senile and has dementia and is difficult and is unthankful and is rude indeed is pure religion. Right? Friends, if you're a caretaker, I want you to understand that there are unique challenges to this job. And so I want to encourage you this morning, don't grow weary in doing good. Don't grow weary in doing good. When we read Galatians 6, it gives us this command. Let us not be weary in well-doing. That word weary is not merely about getting tired. This is not a verse about being tired. This is a verse about being discouraged, tired in your spirit, ready to give up, right? And if you're a caretaker, you understand this well. Friends, let me ask you, I want your participation here. What are some things that make caretaking, caring for kids or elderly people, what makes that particular job especially discouraging at times? What could be especially discouraging about those types of jobs? Unthankfulness. Good. What else? And not just unthankfulness, but I would say even if our kids are thankful or our parent is grateful, it's never proportionate to the amount of work it is. Like, even if they're grateful, it's like, they don't even know how hard it is, right? So unthankfulness, good. What else makes caring for other people especially discouraging or tiring? Yeah, it's really mundane. Like, no one feels glamorous like changing diapers, baby or adult, showering, bathing people. It doesn't feel glamorous, right? It's very mundane. Same old thing, right? What else is difficult about caretaking? Explain what you mean there. Yeah, right. So that kind of fits into our lack of gratitude, but also lack of playing along, right? You're caring for aged mom and dad, and they don't recognize what they need, and they want to fight you on it, right? Good. What else? Well, say again? Yeah. Yes, it overrides your schedule, right? Yeah, no person you're caring for is like, oh, sorry, I forgot you had those dinner plans, They're like, no, take care of me, wah, or, some other verbal cry, right? I need your help. It overrides your schedule, and that's frustrating, right? There's a unique emotional toll, I think, with caretaking, right? Also, I would say that caretaking is challenging, depending on your background, because it doesn't look like success, does it? No one feels validated in this life, or most people don't feel validated by caring for an aging parent. They feel like they're not really going anywhere in life, right? They don't feel like they're successful. But I want you to realize that Paul does not just tell people in this scenario, hey, don't give up. Now quit whining. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, hey, stop being discouraged about taking care of people. You grouchy, unthankful person, don't you know Jesus called you to this? What does he do? He doesn't just address the action, don't get discouraged, but he wants to give you something, friends, that shapes your desires. Why do people get discouraged? People get discouraged because it feels like they're doing work for nothing. No gratitude, no flexibility, no, payback, no money, right? And what does Paul do in this verse? He says, I want you not to give up, not to get discouraged. And then he says, here's the reward. I want to shape your desires, not for the reward of being blessed by those you care for, but by a delayed reward. And again, these verses are taking place in the context of actually generosity in that form of caretaking. Particularly in the church, he's actually exhorting the church to pay for the salary of their pastor. But I think the principle here applies to generosity of life too, right? We will reap if we do not give up. So as your heart is latching its desires not onto rewards in this life, but onto something that is further down the road that Christ himself promises, it is from that desire being met by Jesus that then we don't have to give up. And then we can give and care for other people, okay? Number 3, I want to talk to you about the calling to be a volunteer. The calling to be a volunteer. Volunteer work is work, right? If I asked the crowd, what is a volunteer? Most of you probably say serving or doing work without pay, right? But the word work still shows up, doesn't it? What are some areas of life that we volunteer in? volunteer at church, right? Or we should. You should have a way you're serving your church, especially if you're a member of the church. We volunteer in our communities, right? We could coach kids' sports. There's so many different ways to volunteer. It totally depends on the community. Volunteer may be formal in those settings where you're like signing up. I'll be the kids' soccer coach. Other ways we volunteer is, hey, we go across the street and we mow our neighbor's grass. They didn't ask us, but we know they need help, right? There's so many ways we can volunteer, is there not? But here, I want to speak to you about this because I think being a volunteer actually allows you to do all of the things that glorify Jesus in your workplace, but it magnifies them. It actually boosts them. It's easier to do some of these Christ-glorifying things in a volunteer capacity than it is even in a paid capacity. So listen, even when you're not paid, I think if you're a volunteer, if you're doing a job without pay, without expectation of reward, here's one way you can especially glorify God in those capacities is you need to glorify God with your work ethic even when you're not paid. Right? Colossians 3 is to work heartily as unto the Lord, to do a job with all your might as if you're serving God himself. Listen, God desires for his people, if they are doing something, to go all in on it. Okay? But I've obviously run a largely volunteer organization as a church. I'm the only paid employee of this organization, but we do a lot of things that I cannot possibly do on my own, right? I am on a board of another volunteer-driven organization in our town. I've read books by executives that say stuff like this, that I've heard corporate CEOs say that one of the hardest things in the world is managing volunteers. Why? Well, you could guess. If someone's a volunteer, they're not getting paid to show up, they're more likely to quit, to not show up. If things don't go my way, I quit, right? People don't treat their jobs like that, but they treat their volunteer work that way because they have the flexibility of I'm not depending on this money to make ends meet. But friends, one of the ways that you can especially glorify God as a volunteer, whether that's in the church, in your community, in your neighborhood, is that when you are serving without pay as a volunteer, is to be dependable, to be reliable, to work hard when you show up for your volunteer shift. Look, you have an elective opportunity. You don't have to show up. But if you're going to, do your job, right? And when you do that, friends, listen, I'm telling you, those who work hard as volunteers shine Christ's light in their volunteer organizations. Number two, if you're a volunteer, you can glorify God through evangelism even when you're not paid. Here's the beauty of it. We talked about evangelism, was it last week? We talked about evangelism at work, and many of you talked about one of the biggest challenges in evangelizing at work was policies, right? About, faith and all of these things, right? Here's the beauty. Very rarely does volunteer work have this sort of barricade. And frankly, if you break some policy sharing the gospel, like let's say you do that, what are they going to do? Fire an unpaid volunteer? Okay, who's going to be super sad about that, right? So as a volunteer, you have a unique opportunity to share the gospel. That's why I encourage all of you, you need to be involved in your communities in some way outside of work, if it's at all possible. This is a wonderful opportunity for you to share the gospel. Because at work, you have things you have to get done, or everyone's going to get fired, or everyone's going to get in trouble, right? As a volunteer, it's totally different, right? It's a little looser in the atmosphere, right? The people you're volunteering with, they're not on the clock either. And so it's kind of their personal time. And so what you'll notice as a volunteer, it's sometimes easier to share the gospel in volunteer settings because everyone doesn't have their guard up as much because they're kind of, chilling at the soccer field. They're hanging out by the pool. So it's not really like their guard is up, like they're in their professional environment. It gives you opportunities to share the gospel that are not as easy at the workplace, right? So I want to encourage you to remember the lessons we talked about evangelism. Show that you care. Find ways to turn the conversation to God and find ways to connect with others. Friends, you are called to work in a way that glorifies God, not just at your job. Maybe you're employed, maybe you're not. But if you're a caretaker, if you have free time, and you're using that free time, you're called to glorify God in all of your work. And so let's glorify the Lord, because he has promised a great reward. Father, help us as a church to be people that glorify you in these different work